Disregarding if you have already chosen a piece of software or you are still thinking about it, it is time to get our hands dirty with some cheap tricks up our sleeves. I am Timur Sol and this is Mapmaking 101, and in this episode we will see around 22 different tips, tricks, but also some common mistakes that you are bound to make while mapping. Why am I so certain? Well, with hundreds of maps in my account, I still make the same dull errors from time to time. That's what we are, cursed with poor memory and a drive to get things done fast. But even if you make some mistakes, it's great to not make every mistake possible at once. And this is what this episode is about. So, let's start with some basic stuff that's always worth remembering, and we'll go into some more specific tips later. Tip number 1. Don't go head first. While I myself love creativity to just flow out of me during mapping, I sadly have to acknowledge that creating initial draft is something that helps immensely during your work. So professionals would suggest creating dozens of them and picking the one that is suitable for your needs, but I usually don't go above 5, mostly because I got a rough idea of the map in my head beforehand. The easiest way to create these drafts would be simply using pen and paper. Start with one room, think where the doors are, and outline just the main elements. Don't worry about stuff you will fill later on. The draft is not a floor plan per se. Once you get the draft, you redraw it so it's clean and easier to read for you while you map. This is probably the only moment when you can actually think about the map in a very meta way. Figure out where the traps are suitable, figure out how actual geography and the place works in terms of, I don't know, corridors and sustainability of the whole building. These drafts can be large and small alike, whatever works basically for you. Tip number 2, measure twice, cut once. This is a tip that I learned in other hobbies that I had. A thing that maps usually have is a grid. Be it isometric, hexagon, classic square, and maps are there to make things easier and faster, so players should understand how distances work. If you got spells or weapons prepared, they need to know if they are in range or out of range. You can obviously make a map without a grid, but how will you scale tokens or effects if you yourself don't know what the distances are? For that reason, I recommend to always check your scales and measurements twice. Let's say you're using a classic 5 feet per square grid. If you're planning to build a full house interior, you better make sure that the staircase you put there is at least 1 grid wide. If your objects and assets are too small or too big, the whole map will look like made for a gnome or a giant, depending in which direction you make the mistake. So sometimes you can change the size of the grid in your app, but that won't change the relation between objects on your map. So again, if you got a door that is 5 feet wide, but the whole interior is only 5 squares wide, you're building a corridor, not a room. In all classic maps, you will find a scale, usually down on the map, that is a guideline for every single thing on the map. This may not be true for continent or city maps if you look at the details. For example, artists use symbolic assets for mountains or forests. But for battle maps, you have to make sure that all your objects or all your assets and textures are in the right scale in reference to each other. And speaking of scales, tip number 3, know your DPI. You may be familiar with the abbreviation. If you're not, it means dots per inch. And while the word inch means not much for computers anymore, it means a lot for the quality of your images when you scale them. If you get assets that have a DPI value of 72, for example, you might have a problem with properly scaling them up. Scaling down merges pixels, but scaling up does not produce new quality pixels for your assets. So you're using assets. If you're using assets, make sure you have them in a decent DPI. For me, that's 300, but people are happy with various levels of quality and crispiness. Another thing, if you ever think about printing your maps, you will be asked to provide them in such a DPI that allows the printer to preserve the quality. Printouts need to be clear as the summer sky, and as in contact with the physical map, our eyes are extremely good in detecting any blurriness or issues with the quality. And on that notice, if you're making a map for print, you have to know that beforehand. Don't add work if you don't need to. If you're printing at 50 inches, make sure that your design map accordingly. If 15 inches, that's 15 inches. Tip number 4, order of things. Most graphic programs and most cartographer apps work in a similar way. They utilize some type of layering system that allows the assets to be set on one on another. You can later work with changing layers, but to make things much easier for you initially, I recommend a specific order of things that I use personally for basically all my maps. Think of the map, the whole map, as if it was a real painting, and honestly it kind of is. So the lowest layer is often just a base layer that adds some color or as a reference to the main map. It's also your canvas, so it designates your borders on your map, on the proper map that you're building. You always should start with a general ground layer. If you're building a keep or a dungeon, the first layer is the soil from which the terrain is made. If you're building a space adventure, the ground layer can be a swirling galaxy asset. And if you're building a water-based adventure, your ground will be, in fact, well, water and waves. Very often, I use few ground layers stacked one on another with some additional opacity manipulation, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Second level would be the natural terrain decorations, so pebbles, foliage, leaves, puddles, veins and stones, and other things that belong as near to the ground as it is reasonable in the natural world. As I said in the previous episodes, maps are not just assets jumbled together. Maps are a whole interconnected structure, and as such they function in a context. This context will more often than not prove to be important for the visual aspect of your entire game. That is why this layer is very important. And only after that should you get to the actual terrain on which your characters will stand. If it's a cave, this is the moment when you create the actual paths inside the cave. If it's a mansion or a house, this is the moment when you start creating floors and tiles. The idea is similar. You just put the basic tiles on the layer and decorate them with things that seem viable in specific places. So for example, a kennel or a prison might have scratches on the floor, a torture hole or a hospital will have some old dried up blood, and there might be some, I don't know, small puddles of water on the floor in the bathroom. Again, if you're making a cave or a natural type map, this will require you to think about what type of dust or stones you can find there. Maybe it's full of rocks because of the structure is unstable, but maybe there's a specific construct or monstrous jelly that cleans the cavern every day and the space is simply cleared out. This may or may not be noticed by the player or players, but it adds to your world building prep, and that's also a value in itself. Next, you start walling the place. So creating actual walls on top of the floor pattern, making a division between the external terrain and the actual terrain that you are interested in. The walls are there before the objects inside because you don't want the walls to cover the objects, and seldom will we use any wall decoration. But while you are creating this part, don't forget about doors, windows, and other things that should be inside walls, like bars, arches, hidden doors, you name it. Now you can start furnishing the place, but again, try to start bottom up, so carpets, rugs, flat objects that belong on the ground layer first. It's hard to be precise with naming specific things here, and if you're building a spaceship, the whole carpet idea might sound pretty silly, but maybe it's great, or cables for you. Basically anything that is on the ground but does not compose the general vibe. Ideally, all these floor-based assets should be under the grid that you have, while everything that has a substantial height will be above the grid. Well, we'll talk about this in a second or two. After the floor objects, you add in furniture, torture devices, or anything else. Again, try to keep the principle of bottom up in head. If you got a table with chairs, first use the set of chairs and afterwards put the table in. The almost last thing will be things that hang on the walls or on the ceilings. The final part would be shadowing and lighting of your map, but that's a further point on this list. Keeping this order of things will help you save time immensely, as you won't waste it on fiddling with every singular or even worse, multiple objects every time you add something. Tip number 5, don't expect quick effects. I think that many of us learned the hard way. Map making is not quick if you're supposed to be thorough or solid. And whatever you're building, the basic blocks are the founding on which you further develop. For me, this means that about 30 or 50% of the time I actually spend to create a map, I spend on making the ground and the walls part. And trust me, it's not my favorite part. I love furnishing maps, creating specific places, vibes, but it's only half of the whole experience. For this reason, I recommend building some willpower to prevent this level skipping or order skipping. Seldom do things actually go good if you skip the preparation part, and it's not that much, not that much different over here. The fun fact is, though, that once you get through this rather dull process, it's all downhill from that point. So seriously, focus on making the base as perfect as you can and enjoy the ride once you're done with that. Tip number 6, don't mix perspectives. Not a common thing, but mixing perspectives might really push your map into a very strange vibe that you don't want. The king of perspectives in TTRPG is the top-down view, but actually you can have maps that are emulating a third dimension sense with using a limited perspective for their assets. These assets are bent in a way, as if you're not looking from a 90-degree angle, but 89 or 85 degrees. They still retain their top-down basic property, but are skewed in such a way that they honestly don't fit any other asset if they're not the same type. You can actually use this to your advantage though if you have perspective walls and a confined small space. By using perspective walls, you actually will be able to create a sense of depth, and you can even stack these walls to make the space seem even deeper than a flat map would technically allow you to do. Tip number 7, mix assets in a smart way. Don't ever use just one asset of a specific type. Ever seen a forest with exactly the same trees all around, or a library with exact same books? Honestly, that's more creepy than a haunted mansion. If you don't have a variation of assets, try fiddling around with the sizes or other asset properties, but whenever it is possible, use a variation of objects to make it more eye-pleasing. Also remember here, don't mix graphic styles of your assets. I've been talking about that in the last episode. It's better to have 2-3 trees that are varying in sizes and rotations than 10 different trees, but all of them from different sets representing a different style of art. Tip number 8, size matters. The worst thing that you can do is act haphazardly when making a whole set of maps. While it is okay to build a standalone map the size that you want, if you are making a bigger compound of sorts, keep in mind the sizes of specific places. If I'd give you a completely blank mansion map right now, you would most probably have no issues with telling me which spaces I designed for specific purposes. Which one's the bathroom, the storage, the sleeping room, or the grand hall, or the dining room. This is because we are instinctively aware that small places are cozy and intimate, while bigger places are meant for gatherings, meetings, and the sorts. Also, try to preemptively think what scenarios could happen where. If you're planning a fight of some sorts, you should have at least one space that has a size big enough for all the players and monster to fit in. Else you end up with a fight with half of the team waiting in line because they can't get into the room at all. Tip number 8, I believe. I have lost track. Symmetry and right angles are not your friend. Big punch to all perfectionists here, but perfect symmetry seldom exists in humanoid created spaces. While a spaceship can be symmetrical and a room also can be symmetrical, this principle of symmetry does not apply to interiors per se. Doors, for example, are usually in the middle of the wall, but not always. Temples often have niches that run along one wall only. Decorations nearly never come in pairs, so even if you are tempted to put this second plant near the door because it would fill a composition, you should stop, drop, and roll, because you just got tricked by your own brain. We strive for perfect angles and symmetry, especially when presented with assets on a neatly knit grid that guides us. But let's be honest, who has perfectly aligned chairs near their dinner table? The bed may be under a perfect angle near the walls, sure, but the chest that sits next to it, How odd would it be for the owner to leave it perfectly aligned? Or a carpet near the desk. In our times, you'd use maybe tape to make it sit in one place, but yeah, you think that people always had that in hand? Carpets would also be slightly off. This subtle head chaos, as I call it, make things more accessible for our brains because we're more familiar with it from our own surroundings. So my recommendation would be to ditch the perfect planner mindset and sometimes rotate random stuff by like 2 degrees, 3 degrees. Move it a bit to the side, make it a little bit less perfect. Tip number 10. There's more than one grid. Almost all maps have some sort of grid. but almost always it's the god-awful thick black square horror that destroys any finesse that you had or that you made while creating your map. My honest recommendation is to get rid of that awful abomination and start thinking of the grid as the element, of the map, not a meta level. On some maps you can do it in a natural way by choosing floor tiles, for example, that already have a grid embedded in it, but that's not common. The other way is to actually create a grid of your own and use it as a floor tile type asset that you can set on the top level of your floors. This will allow you to actually have different grids in different places. I once had a situation where on one map I had the ground in 3 colors: black, white, and yellow. If I would use any classic monocolor grid on these places, one of them wouldn't be seen actually, because that would be impossible. And thanks to using colors or colored variants in the grid, I managed to use the white one where the floor was black and vice versa. And the yellow sand I covered with a pink grid, so it had better visibility. Also, if you think about the grid as a layer per se, you will have the option to actually change things like its consistency. You can make a dotted grid, a wobbly grid, or any other option you find good for your game. Next tip, don't be afraid to go outside the box. You might stumble on a situation where you won't be able to do something because you lack assets, options, or possibilities to represent something that you want. Now, remember that your app is just a tool, nothing more, nothing less. Let me put it this way. If you're building a fence and you need a smaller plank because you want to make sure your doggo has a hole through which he can peek on the street, you don't stop just because you don't have the plank that is shorter. You make it shorter. Similarly, when you are out of assets, figure out what you can jumble together. Scourge the internet in search for ways around your problem, or maybe check the previous video in which I've been talking about appropriate assets and finding them or making them. Or maybe it's an effect you want to achieve. Well, maybe it's time to learn how to apply effects in some basic graphic processing software. By now you should probably be aware that different jobs require different tools, and that is also very correct here. If you need a old paper filter for a world map, that will be basically way easier to achieve in post-processing than in the app itself. Tip number 12. Opacity is a tool, and so are other asset manipulations. Depending on your software, you may or may not have access to different ways in which you can manipulate pre-made assets. Most commonly is the transparency and opacity tool, one that allows you to change how much the asset is actually visible. This tool is particularly one that I find the most usable or most useful, as it allows for seamless transitions between different terrain layers, but also it makes some more evident assets blend into the background a little bit better. Very often I use a combination of low opacity and low brightness to form stains on the ground or on the furniture. They seldom have a mechanical or narrative meaning, but for me they'll fill the unnaturally uniform spaces that we sometimes have to create. Imagine a kitchen without any stains on the wooden floor. That's absurd. It will look like the owner shipped the whole kitchen last week from IKEA. I definitely don't want that in my maps. Another good use for opacity is to create chandeliers and lamps that hang above the room, but may be important for some reasons. Similarly, you can use hue or saturation or brightness to differentiate your assets from each other, even if just a little bit. If you have one book spine asset, but you want more, how about simply making copies of it and changing some values around so they don't look exactly the same? Experiment. Tip number 13, don't fixate on small things. We all sometimes fixate on stuff we think is the core issue of the problem, which usually is not the actual issue. One thing is the fact that you miss an asset and your ideal map is not finished until you find it or you do something with it. I recently had this exact problems and it ended up in me simply making the asset. I think it took me like 2 hours to make it perfect, but it clicked and it tied the whole scene together. But that's often not the case. Often we have a tendency to focus on unimportant things like animations. Trust me, if you make your map and only thing you are missing is an animated flame for each torch, you're actually already done and now you're just having fun. So learn where you are and how to tell yourself to stop obsessing and move on if you don't want to waste your precious time that you could spend on making another cool map. 14. Don't underestimate what you can't see. I'm always very evangelical when it comes to shadows and lights in maps. These two are the last part of my every map. Only when I finish setting up every asset, I prepare the proper mood, like night or narrow corridors. First, it does make a stronger immersion for players. It's kind of strange to have an encounter in the night with all the lights on, right? Light is relatively easy though, as it simply shines where it can. Only thing worth being careful about is the so-called spotlights, so places that are highly reflective and deserve a special shine, if that's possible, obviously. Shadows, on the other hand, are slightly more complicated, as you can have two classic types of those. One is the hard shadow. This is a shadow that is created by a shape of a thing that it is cast by. Seldom will we have an option to create real long shadows for an asset, as technically nearly nobody prepares assets like those. But a top-down shadow is absolutely possible, and if your software allows the change of opacity and brightness, you can easily add such nearly invisible black blob under your asset proper to emulate a shadow using that trick. Another type of shadow is the soft shadow, which is a type of shade that simply has less access to light. These are commonly found in the less sunny side of a hill, or mostly in corridors, corners, or rooms like hallways. For this reason, I try to always line my walls and lines with a semi-transparent shadow effect. There's also one more special, though technically unseen asset type that's worth mentioning here: the overlay asset. These are assets that create an illusion of dynamic movement or narrate the story on itself. A great example of such assets would be a tile that suggests movement of grass on your green tiles, thus making them understandable for your brain that this is in fact grass. Oh, and just one more thing: shadows are not black. They are bluish or purple, but they are not black. So before you end your map, think where the shadows would fall. The next tip is: don't go extreme. Yeah, you don't basically want to make a map that is 1,000 feet wide and long. Just that. This is the tip. While it's fun to make such maps, if your software allows it, you definitely don't want to end up with an enormous map that you can't use because no printer and no VTT will be able to process it. So don't think about your whole scene as one enormous complex, but a set of scenes that you can cut in pieces and use. I know it's tempting to create a ginormous sandbox and see how things unfold, but it's neither narrative nor roleplay encouraging, honestly, as it makes the game basically a board game of sorts. So know your limits, but also know the limits of usability of your maps. Tip number 16 is: use your imagination. Imagination in a TTRPG game? Blasphemy! Often we go into a full technical and practical mode when mapping, instead of remembering that the place we are creating has to have a feeling, a vibe of sorts. So when choosing your assets and things you want on the map, figure it out as if you were there. Let's say you're making an abandoned prison map. It's been left like that after an awful monster attack that dug its way into it. This already tells us what we need: spiderwebs, dust, lots of debris, chains, bars, ruined wood, and depending on the monster you have, skeletons or corpses or something else. And now if you close your eyes and walk from room to room, you could make every room different in that way. Maybe there's a puddle from natural water condensation somewhere, maybe there's a note left on the floor. Generally speaking, if you have issues with filling a place, remember you're not only a constructor, but the narrator of the space. Tip number 17, not boxy, not alien. Depending on how much time you will have for making the map, you will make it more or less complicated. As usual, the best would be to stay somewhere in the middle. You don't want to fall into something that professional mappers call a boxy design. That roughly means that we have a map that is based on a room, hallway, room concept. Sometimes that's a viable option and sometimes not, mostly the second one. But it kind of boils down to understanding that boxes are pretty much everywhere. And while they are everywhere, the boxes have to differ to make a fun variety. So, on the other end of the spectrum, there's this alien design, a messy design where you don't see any coherent idea in the map. There's no clear flow visible, no concept. What I aim for usually is a meaningful way to break away from the grid while avoiding also classic 45-degree bends. Designs that break lines of sight without forced patterns, straight from a PC shooter game, that is the way to go. Speaking of, next tip, line of sight and obstacles. I will talk about this a little bit more in episode 6, but since we're talking about tips, a must-have on most maps is something that breaks line of sight or can be used as a cover, hiding place, or anything similar. Without that, you're just left with an empty space or semi-empty space. And honestly, you could just give up on making maps meaningful because nothing matters if a map is just a battleground with stuff laying around here and there, and there's no nuance to it. Obviously, there are exceptions. A corridor with traps can be empty if sometimes tiles are special, but consider the purpose of any place you are building. If a fight is possible, think about how you can move around the place during the combat and what both sides can use to their advantage. Tip number 19. Tone it down a bit. Besides line work, it's nearly always better to use softer tools and more subtle brushes. While yes, corners of rooms are right angles, janky or super edgy corners seldom appear in nature, especially on terrain layers or in very natural terrains. I see a lot of people creating caverns, caves, cliffs, and a whole lot of other places with hard strokes and lines. These, while sometimes even make sense, seldom are useful in game scenarios, and in a general look, they look like they've been made in a hurry. Instead of triangles, try more rounded shapes and blend stuff together. Don't be afraid of lowering your transparency of your objects by a point or two, even if they are solid objects. While this might sound a bit crazy, these 2 points won't mean much for the asset itself, but will blend the entire scene together more. Years ago I had a hobby that required me to cut rigged material in proper shapes and form them later. And to do that I did not use extreme force, but patience. So again, if there's a possibility, be more subtle with brushes and the way in which you use them. Be more subtle with lines and angles and just take your time. Tip number 20. Stack stuff. Another slightly counterintuitive advice, but often stacked stuff looks better and gives you a sense of depth. This is especially right if you do that for natural or irregular things like bushes, trees, or rocks. I very often stack rock assets on top of each other to just make a unique texture type that I will later copy and paste in other places with obviously slight rotations and changes in size and sorts. Another good example of stacked assets are cliffs. Thanks to a little offset and change in scale, you can create an illusion of great depth. This paired with a proper shadow and one of the earlier tricks, the one with the grid, you can really create a perspective on the map, although it's top-down. Also, often you have things that would naturally be stacked, and while yes, it will seem that most of the objects below will be hidden, at the same time small parts of them will protrude from underneath and give a visual cohesion to the whole scene. Things like barrels, crates, bottles, and patches of dirt and overlays sometimes look better when stacked on top of another. Tip number 21. Eyes on the prize. Keep focused. The goal of your battle map is threefold. It helps you organize your thoughts and your ideas. It is, I hope, fun, but most importantly, it is meant to be the background of a combat situation that will ensue on it. Your party will most likely keep somewhere in the general middle, as that's where the action happens. So keep thinking about making that place functional in all the ways that you need, while treating the external or border parts of the frame as basically a frame of sorts, a way in which you close your composition. You will never be able to fully anticipate what players will do on your battle map. Hell, they might not even be willing to fight, but it is your job to give them and yourself a proper possibilities to play around with your map and have a blast. A good fantasy encounter map will most likely be no larger than 200 feet across. That amount of space should be enough for you to build a couple of buildings, a market square, or an interior of a big cavern. Remember, you are not building a computer or console game. You are building a battle map for your game. And finally, the last piece of advice. While I try to keep these tips as general as possible, there's no way for all of them to work for everyone, and more importantly, in every app on the market. It would be ideal if everyone had all the options, but sometimes developers hit a rock that they just can't displace or dispel, and roll with what they have and what they were able to build. You may, for example, not have the ability to change some aspects of your assets, but that doesn't mean your app is defunct or flawed. So the final piece of advice is know your software. While all my tips should definitely help you get into a proper perspective for your future mappings, there is nothing that will replace a solid understanding of where you are and what you are doing. There are tutorials for most of the apps out there. If you take your time to learn stuff, you took a step in the right direction. This concludes this episode, and in the next one, we'll take a trip to the real world and learn how to get a mapper's block out of your way, how to plan your maps so that they feel real, but also are reasonable on a subconscious level. Until then, happy mapping, heathens. Peace out.